Welcome. This is DA Sports. I'm your host, DASASIN. Thank you. This is episode 39. Now, in today's episode, we have a couple of things to get into. It's basically going to be a complete recap of episode 38. So, of course, to start, we're going to recap my question of the week from last episode about which matchup would you prefer to see in the Super Bowl, only out of the four options that I gave you. Then, after that, we're going to finish with my recap of the Divisional Round playoffs, go over all of my picks as a whole, and break down each game. So let's get into it. Okay, so for starters, we are going to recap my question of the week. For those, just as a reminder from last episode, the question of the week from last episode was, which Super Bowl matchup would you prefer to see? And I gave you four different options and stated that it had to be one of these four options that you chose for your answer. The options were Buffalo versus Detroit, Kansas City versus Philadelphia, Baltimore versus the Rams, or Houston versus Washington. Now, based on the feedback that I got back, there was at least one pick for every single selection that was possible, which is what I expected based on, people's general fandom and stuff like that. And I felt like the matchups were evenly based as far as each matchup having something that people might want to see as far as the reason why they picked that option. But in terms of the majority of people picked Baltimore versus the Rams as their choice for which one they would want to see. Now, some of that might have been skewed for a couple of different reasons. I, of course, live in Southern California. The local home team are technically the Rams and the Chargers. I would say out here, the Rams have more fans than the Chargers, mainly because a lot of us still associate the Chargers with San Diego. So it could be that part of the reason why that received most of the votes is because there are more Rams fans here than anything else. Well, not anything else, but anything out of the selections that you had to choose from. I would say most of the people around here are fans of the Raiders more than anything else. But out of the options that I gave, the Rams would probably be the number one fandom in this area. I know somebody else also chose that matchup because they are a Titans fans, and so they like Derrick Henry. And with Derrick Henry now being on Baltimore, they were looking forward to seeing Derrick Henry potentially in the Super Bowl. Now, for me personally, obviously, I'm a Chiefs fan. So if I had to choose any of the matchups, I was obviously going to choose the Chiefs versus the Eagles. But if not choosing that game for the purpose of it being my team, the next matchup I probably would have chosen was also the same one that everybody else chose, what a majority of people chose, which was Baltimore versus the Rams. Now, the reason that I would have chose that matchup is because I think that it would have made for a good matchup in terms of each team balance against each other. I think there would have been different dynamics brought to the table. I also would have picked that matchup because I think it would be good to see Lamar Jackson kind of get over the hump and finally get a Super Bowl win if the Chiefs weren't going to win the Super Bowl. So, like I said, taking my fandom out of it, that would have been the choice I would have made. But nonetheless, I do think that each option had its own positives and negatives. So I appreciate everybody who commented on all of the different platforms and gave me their feedback. And that was it for the recap of the question of the week. Now, to finish off this episode, we are going to get into my recap from the Divisional Round playoffs. Now, the Divisional Round was very exciting. Each game, to me, was exciting. Unlike the wild card round where most of the games were blowouts and only one game was really exciting, all of these games were exciting for different reasons, but nonetheless, it was definitely good football. It's kind of like how the saying goes, the cream always rises to the top. It's as we get, lower and lower in the amount of teams that are left still playing in their season, you have better and better competition, and it brings out the best out of each team. So now going into each of these games one by one in chronological order, of course, we're going to start with the Chiefs at home against the Houston Texans. Now, before I actually dive into this, to summarize my picks for this week overall, I did end up going 2-2, and we'll talk about which ones I got right and which ones I got wrong and why and so on and so forth. Now, into the first game itself, the Kansas City Chiefs at home against the Houston Texans. Now, the Chiefs, at the time that I made my pick, and which was earlier in the week, the line was -8. So the Chiefs were favored to win by 8 points. It did, right before game time, eventually get up to 9.5. But most people who bet are not betting right before the game starts. So most people got either 8 or 8.5. I know some people who bet like early in the morning on Saturday got it at 9. But essentially, we're going to go off of the line that I picked at the time that I said it and say it was 8. Now, in my picks, I, of course, picked the Chiefs to win, which I was right about. The part that I was wrong about this game was that I actually thought that the Chiefs would not cover the spread. My prediction was the final score was going to be 24-20. And even though I was close on the Chiefs score side, I was very wrong on the Texans side. The Chiefs ended up scoring 23. The Texans finished with 14. So the Chiefs, for my spread that I had, the Chiefs did cover the spread. But for those who got the spread right before the game, they didn't. Now, this game was a very tough game. Both defensive lines played outstanding. I think in terms of the battle between O-line and D-line, I think both defensive lines beat the crap out of the other offensive lines. It was completely dominant, and I think that the defensive line played a huge factor in the outcome of the game. I think one of the biggest reasons why the Chiefs won is because the Chiefs had 8 sacks, and it's really hard to win a game when they're getting that much pressure on you. I don't care who the team is. I don't care who the quarterback is. If your offensive line is getting destroyed, it's hard to win. I think case in point, in the study that everybody uses this as a reference, was when the Chiefs went into the Super Bowl against Tampa Bay and they got blown out because their offensive line was in shambles. They had injuries across the line, and Mahomes couldn't do anything. He was running for his life all day. And keep in mind, those two teams had played each other earlier in the year, and the Chiefs won the game easily. So that shows you just how important the offensive line was. I do think that the Chiefs' offensive line has gotten better in recent weeks since they moved Tooney from guard to tackle. But nonetheless, there were still times where Will Anderson was able to get by him because Tooney isn't built like a tackle. Typically speaking, most tackles have longer arms because they're out on their own on an island majority of the time. Guards are typically more shorter and more stout, more compact, because a lot of times the guard is the primary lineman that pulls on pull plays. So they have to be more athletic in terms of movement from, a 3-point stance into pulling across and as a part of their blocking scheme. Whereas tackles, for the majority of the time, if it's even a run block, they're usually just going head up. And on a pass play, they're usually out on the island against the defensive end, or if you got somebody blitzing off the edge, like a corner or safety, something like that. So Tooney isn't built for a tackle, but he's doing a lot better job than all the other tackles they've used throughout the season. So overall, it was good enough to get the job done. I think the biggest thing, which we really saw a theme with in the other games, is there were no turnovers. In the playoffs, Turnovers in general are costly, but in the playoffs, they're double costly because there is such a smaller margin of error come playoff time. So if you turn the ball over, it's hard to win. The Chiefs did not turn the ball over at all in this game. And actually, for Houston's sake, they didn't turn the ball over at all either. But they were ultimately just outmatched because in crucial time after crucial time, when they seemed to be clawing back into the game, they got sacked. So that was a great part of the defense. Now, I am going to briefly talk about these controversial calls that everybody wants to kind of point to as the reason why the Chiefs won. Now, if you legitimately think that the only reason the Chiefs won is because of these calls, then you really don't know football, okay? Now, there were 2 calls. The first one, well, actually now, according to online, there's 3 different calls. 2 that were called, 1 that wasn't. And I'll address all of those quickly. The first one, where Will Anderson came in while Mahomes was in the pocket. It was a 3rd down play, and he hit him like right under the chin, his face mask to the chin, and they called roughing the passer. Now, when I first saw this play, full speed, I was like, oh yeah, it's definitely roughing the passer. He hit him helmet to helmet, and his head moved back. Then they turned it to the side, and I could see that the impact from face mask to face mask wasn't that rough, and so I was like, okay, yeah, I guess that's not roughing the passer. But I understand why the ref called it, because the ref who's making the call is actually behind Mahomes, and from the angle that the ref is, you see his head go around his head, and then you see Mahomes' head go backwards. So innately, it looks like there's forcible contact to the head. So I was like, once they turned to the side, I said, oh, well, it wasn't roughing the passer, but I understand why they threw the flag. Because even though he made contact with the head, it wasn't forcible. Well, then later, come to find out, according to the rules, it doesn't have to be forcible. Any contact to the head can be deemed roughing the passer when the quarterback is throwing from the pocket. So, in that case, even though I still thought it wasn't based on the side view, it still technically counted as a legit flag. So, that really shouldn't have been an issue. Now, the second call was when Mahomes was scrambling, and then he decided to kind of like run back to the inside, and then he slid, and then the 2 defenders came over the top. Now, for some reason, people seem to have this narrative like, oh, they didn't contact him, they just hit each other. I'm like, yeah, they mostly hit each other, but they definitely made contact with his helmet. Now, I get people being upset because, yes, the slide was definitely late, but based on how the rules are written, if you make any contact with the quarterback's helmet after a slide, it's a flag. Now, as a person who played defense and prided himself on hard hits in football, I don't like the call. If this was back when I was still playing football, I would have been just as pissed as everybody else who was playing defense. I know that the way I played would not work for how the NFL rules currently are, because I was definitely trying to kill anybody that I came in contact with at all times. I didn't give a 2 shits about their well-being at any moment. So, yes, I probably would have gotten a foul there too. But based on how the rules are written, it's a foul. The same thing that happened to Trevor Lawrence. Now, people will say, well, the Trevor Lawrence one had a little more space. Yeah, technically, but the Trevor Lawrence one, he was more upright right before the contact happened, as opposed to the Mahomes one where he went straight down. So nonetheless, it's still letter of the law. It was the right call. The only other one I'm address is now people are putting this thing online about, oh, there was a hip drop tackle in the game that they should have thrown a flag for. Okay, and I've said the same thing in every single post I've seen. Show me video of one game this year where somebody did a hip drop tackle and they threw the flag on that play. I haven't seen not one. Yet those type of tackles happen all the time. It's not a thing, right? And they even said when they first implemented the rule that most of these times when stuff like this happens, it's going to be a fine basis. They're going to go through afterwards and go, okay, there was a hip drop tackle here. We're going to fine you, and then if this keeps happening, we're going to increase the fines. They even said so when they first talked about it in the preseason, that it's going to be very rare, if ever, that you're going to see a flag thrown on the field at the time of it, because it's so subjective, right? So this whole outcry of like, oh, they didn't throw the flag for a hip drop tackle, show me where they did throughout the entire season. And I have yet to find anybody who's been able to find me one. Now, I'm sure there might be one during the season, but I bet you'll find several other examples of hip drop tackles where there was no flag thrown. So this is not specific to this game, so please stop crying. But that's all the time I'm going to spend on that issue. Again, the Chiefs won the game. They were the better team overall. It was a good game, but they pulled off the win, and they covered the spread as it was initially set. Now, the second game in the divisional round was the Detroit Lions versus the Washington Commanders. Now, this game, Detroit was favored by 9.5. They were at home. I picked Detroit to win, but I got to be honest, it wasn't a pick that I had much confidence in going in. And actually, after I made all of my picks and realized that I had picked everyone who was a favorite, I knew that at least one of them was going to be wrong, because I can't recall the last time where every single favorite in the divisional round went on to the championship game. And I was going to go back and change one, and this was the one I would have changed, but I was like, it's done, it's done. I'm going to leave it as is, especially since I like Detroit in a general sense. Like, I like their head coach. I like a lot of their players. So I'm like, all right, you know what? For the sake of Detroit, I'll leave it as B. But if you recall from my picks, I emphatically stated that there was no way Detroit was going to win by 9.5 points. My score projection was 30-27, so I had them winning by 3. I knew for a fact there was no way they were going to win by 9.5 or even close to like a touchdown. I said it was going to be back and forth, and then maybe they'd get a last-second field goal, something like that. So they ended up losing. Not only did they lose, but they lost huge. Final score was 45-31. Now, I expected this game to be the highest scoring game of the week, which it was. I was not expecting the total score to end up being 76 points, especially considering the first half, the total score, I believe, was 51 or 52, something like that, which is crazy. 51 points and a half is ridiculous. But it plays to the point of, if you have so many injuries on defense, there's only so much you can do. I think we kind of all got duped by seeing the last game of the season with Detroit versus Minnesota, where Minnesota was ineffective. And so we're like, oh, well, maybe they figured it out. Maybe they got all of these backups to the backups to perform at their best, and now they're clicking, and their defense will show up and be okay. Then we saw how Minnesota looked in the wild card round against the Rams, which was more telling of, okay, maybe that last game of the season wasn't really indicative of Detroit figuring it out. Maybe it was more indicative of Minnesota not figuring it out. And I think based on the way this game played out, it's definitely more of a Minnesota issue than a Detroit positive issue. So Detroit's defense looked as most teams would expect a defense with a bunch of backups to look, and they got destroyed. Got to give it up to Jaden Daniels. He played magnificent. I'd have to say at this point he's had the most impressive rookie season by a quarterback ever. Now, I don't know about rookie quarterbacks from, before I was born and so on and so forth, but as far as I can remember, in my lifetime watching football on a regular basis, which goes back to when I was 8, which was 1992. Well, 91 is actually when I really started watching, but 92 is when I got into it even further. So even since 1991, I can't recall a rookie quarterback coming in, taking over a team that won 4 games previously, and then takes his team all the way to the conference final. Like, that's crazy. I know C.J. Stroud came close last year because he took over a terrible team and then got his team to the playoffs, winning their division, and then won their first playoff game, but then they lost in the divisional round. So that one was really impressive, but what Jaden Daniels has done this year is even more impressive, especially because of the way the team is constructed. I would say that C.J. Stroud had a great year last year, but their success wasn't primarily based on his effectiveness. It was more so based off of a strong defense, and, they had a really good receiving core. Not taking anything away from Stroud, I think he had a great season, but I think this Washington team is more dependent on Jaden Daniels' success. If he plays excellent, they win. If he doesn't, they don't. It essentially comes down to that, because their defense is nowhere near as good as what Houston's defense was last year with C.J. Stroud was a rookie. So Jaden Daniels is very impressive, and to be honest, at this point, anything's possible for them. I think Washington is capable of winning the Super Bowl. That's right. Not even just winning this upcoming week against Philadelphia. They're capable of winning the Super Bowl, because anytime you have a young quarterback who doesn't seem to get bothered by any negativity, who stays poised, can throw the ball anywhere on the field, and also has mobility, and he's got good enough weapons around him, anything is possible. So excited to see what happens going forward. But even if they do lose to Philadelphia in the NFC Championship game, he's had the most remarkable, rookie season ever as a quarterback, and it has to be applauded. And now back in terms of Detroit, it's definitely disappointing. They had high hopes. I still think that if their team remained more healthy, they would definitely have been in the Super Bowl this year. Before the season started, I picked Detroit to go to the Super Bowl because of how I felt like their team was constructed. But part of the reason why, when the playoffs started, I said that the team I picked to go to the Super Bowl from the NFC was Philadelphia is because I believe that Detroit's injuries were just going to be too much. And I think they definitely showed itself to be true with the way they played against Washington. Now, the third game of the divisional round was the Philadelphia Eagles at home against the Los Angeles Rams. This was another game that was really good. At times, it seemed like Philadelphia was going to pull away, and then late in the game, the Rams just kind of reeled them in. Philadelphia's kicker was really off for a lot of times. Now, granted, the conditions were really bad. They had the most snow out of all four of these games that happened this weekend. It was really, really cold. And the only real effective part of Philadelphia was Saquon Barkley. And this just further rubs in the narrative of how terrible New York Giants fans have to feel, because Saquon Barkley has looked like the most impressive player in all of the playoffs so far. From the wild card week and the divisional round, if you were picking like an MVP of each round, it was Saquon Barkley. And he just continues to look unstoppable. And if he continues to look like this in the championship round and in the Super Bowl, then they probably end up being Super Bowl champs, because Jalen Hurts looked like he suffered an injury in the game. It looked to be slowing him down a little bit. There was like at least a full series where he didn't really move that much. He just was handing the ball off. Even on his rollouts, he wasn't very smooth with the rollouts. So we'll see how that progresses going forward. If that injury ends up lingering, they didn't really detail exactly what it was, so we'll see how that goes. But if Saquon keeps playing the way he's playing and the defense keeps playing the way they're playing, anything is possible. Speaking of their defense, and I mentioned this for those of you who follow me online on Facebook, I mentioned this on Facebook during the game. Jalen Carter, the defensive tackle that plays for Philadelphia, that got drafted 10th overall, who was projected to be a number 1 or number 2 pick in that draft if it wasn't for his off-the-field issues. That was a steal of the draft. And people said it then. It's been solidified now. I'm going to say, I said it on Facebook, I'm going to say it again right now. I think Jalen Carter is going to be the best defensive tackle in the league in about 2 years. I think he's already a top 5 defensive tackle in the league, even though this is only his second year in the league. But I think within 2 years, he'll probably be the best in the league. I think Chris Jones is clearly the best D tackle in the league right now, and he has been for the last couple of years. But, obviously he's almost 30 at this point. So by the time he's 32, I could definitely see Jalen Carter replacing him as that top dog as far as defensive tackle, ending up with double-digit sacks year after year and just being disruptive. That's the thing that a lot of people don't understand. Defensive tackles typically are not designed to get pressure on your quarterback. Defensive tackles are typically designed to kind of hold up the middle of the lines, and so that the linebackers can shoot gaps and make tackles behind the line of scrimmage or get easier reads on where the play is going. Sometimes you'll get dominant defensive tackles who will at least cause the pocket to collapse a little bit by pushing the center or guard back some. But it's rare that you see a defensive tackle who can consistently get sacks, because it's a whole other issue, especially because defensive tackles get double teamed more than anybody else. When you're on the end, more often than not, if you're going along the outside, you're one-on-one. You might get chipped by a back or tight end or receiver or something like that, but in general sense, they get one-on-one blocks more so than D tackles. D tackles are often double teamed with guard center, guard tackle, so they have to fight through more on more occasions. So for a D tackle to be able to deal with that and still get sacks the way Jalen Carter has done, And to be able to turn it up in the playoffs when it counts the most is just definitely impressive. Definitely somebody that everybody should be keeping an eye on. I actually hope that he makes it into the NFL Top 100 that they release before the beginning of the following season, because I think he's definitely a top 100 player today. So Philadelphia looks impressive, and we'll look forward to seeing what they do in the conference championship against the Commanders. Now, the last game of the divisional round was the Baltimore Ravens versus the Buffalo Bills. Now, Baltimore was favored to win by 1 point. This is another game that I was wrong about because they did lose. Final score was 27-25. Now, as I mentioned, for the week I went 2-2. So Kansas City and Philadelphia I got right. Detroit and Baltimore I got wrong. This game, though, was sad because this was a game, to be honest, I picked Baltimore to blow out Buffalo. My score was 38-20. They didn't get anywhere near 38, and they gave up more than 20. This game, at the end of the day, the responsibility falls on Lamar Jackson. Now, I'm not one of these Lamar Jackson haters. I really, really like Lamar. I even mentioned in my question of the week that if I wasn't picking the Chiefs-Eagles matchup, the pick that I would have picked was Baltimore versus the Rams because I like Lamar Jackson. So, understand that this is coming with the context of this is not Lamar hate. This is just pure facts. As I mentioned earlier, turnovers are crucial. Majority of the time, if you lose a turnover battle, you're going to lose the game. And I said that doubles with heightened, sense of truth when it comes to playoff turnovers. And Lamar Jackson had 2 terrible turnovers. It's one thing if you have a turnover where it's like it's out of your control, right? If you throw the ball to the receiver and it hits him in the chest and he doesn't catch it and it bounces off his chest and the defender catches it, as a quarterback, there's nothing you can do. You just got to live with it. That happens. If you're dropping back to pass and then you throw across the middle, but a defensive tackle gets his hand up and the ball gets tipped up in the air and then get caught, yeah, it still counts as an interception, but at least you can look at it and go, all right, that wasn't the quarterback's fault. Both of these turnovers in this game were Lamar Jackson's fault and nobody else's. The interception he threw was terrible. Probably the worst pass he's thrown on any interception he had this year. Like, it wasn't even within range of the intended target. And, sometimes the passes can look off because, the person ran the wrong route or they ran the route at the wrong depth or at the wrong angle. This wasn't that situation. It was just like he was throwing to a spot thinking his receiver was going to get there before the DB, but it was just so poorly placed in time that he rushed it and basically threw the ball straight to Buffalo. It was a terrible decision. It was a terrible throw, and that's on him. Then the fumble that he had was even worse because he's trying to avoid a sack. He slips out of the sack, but he's carrying the ball with one hand. And keep in mind, these were the second worst conditions out of all 4 of these games. It was snowy. It was cold. In those conditions, not only is the ball super hard because of the cold, it's also slippery. So it's really hard to carry the ball with one hand while you're trying to avoid defenders, and you're also on one leg because somebody's grabbing you. And sure enough, he dropped the ball. He dropped the ball on a drive where they were driving, and it led to Buffalo taking the ball back for a good amount of yards, and they ended up getting points off of it. So his turnovers directly led to 10 points. They lost the game by 2 points. I don't know how anybody places the blame on anybody but Lamar. Now, I'm not saying Lamar Jackson had 100% of the blame, but if we're giving it percentages, I got to at least give him 75. At least. Now, I would put probably, I'll lower it. I'll give Lamar 70. I'll give the offensive coordinator, head coach, whoever's responsible for it, 20%, and I'll give Mark Andrews 10%. Mark Andrews gets 10% because he did have a turnover. He fumbled the ball, and then he also did drop the 2-point conversion that would have tied the game. Now, personally, I think based on how the game was going, even if he would have caught that pass and tied the game, I think Buffalo had a minute and a half left. I think they would have gotten a field goal range and won the game. So as much as that was crucial and it essentially ended the game for them having a chance to come back, I don't think it would have changed the game even if he caught it. Now, the fumble itself is crucial because I just finished talking about how important turnovers are. So that's definitely on him. But the 20% I'm putting on the offensive coordinators because they clearly haven't learned their lesson. And I know they changed offensive coordinators a couple years ago, but the same offensive coordinator that was there last year is there this year. And it's the same recipe. When the Baltimore Ravens lost to the Chiefs in the playoffs, it was like, why didn't they give the ball to the running backs more? They're a running team. And I've said all season long, the key to Baltimore winning games was giving the ball to Derrick Henry. I even stated to the point that Derrick Henry was the MVP of the Ravens and not Lamar Jackson for that very reason, because his production, not even his production, his opportunities for production were a direct correlation to their wins and losses. I pulled up the stats yesterday after this game, and anytime Derrick Henry got at least 20 carries in a game, the Baltimore Ravens were 9-0. Okay? In the games where he got less than 20 carries, which includes this game, they were 4-6. I feel like as much analytics that goes into today's games, how does that get missed? I feel like even if it seems like he's not being productive, if you have a stat where there's a hard line, okay, he gets 20 carries, we win, give him 20 carries. Even if it doesn't make any sense, for shit's sake, just give him 20 carries. And it wasn't like he wasn't effective. He was averaging over 5 yards per carry. They only gave him the ball 16 times. For what? Give him the ball. It doesn't make any sense. And at this point, that's on them. They're going to learn the hard way. They're going to keep being miserable. They're going to keep throwing away these seasons where Lamar Jackson's getting better and better, but you can't get it done in the playoffs. And essentially today, Lamar Jackson is the modern-day Peyton Manning. Now, I'm not saying Lamar Jackson in the regular season is as good as Peyton Manning was in the regular season. But if you recall, back in the day, that was a thing that was against Peyton Manning. He was great during regular season. He could put up great stats. His teams had great wins. They were always near the top of the standings. Then come playoff time, he would lose. And he would play his worst games of the season during the playoffs. And for the most part, Lamar Jackson's career has been the same. This is the first year where his playoff game wasn't the worst game he played in the season, but it still wasn't good enough when you had 2 turnovers. So, like I said, this is a bad loss for them. As for Buffalo, it's a great win for them. They haven't been in the AFC Championship game in a while. They have been losing in the divisional round. I think like 2 out of the last 3 times or 3 out of the last 4, something like that. So, great win for them to advance to the AFC Championship game. And they're doing it against a rival that they already beat this season, which was that team's only loss during the season. So Buffalo has to be really confident getting over this game, going into the next game. Josh Allen looked great. Even though his stats weren't really gaudy, it's a product of what we talked about when it comes to playoffs. It's about execution and understanding the game flow and understanding what needs to be done and what not needs to be done, right? You can't turn the ball over. So he didn't turn the ball over. No, he didn't have any touchdowns, but he didn't need to have any touchdowns. He was able to execute enough to get them to win, and they got the win. And so we'll see how everything is going forward. So that wraps it up for this week's episode. I want to thank you all for tuning in. Please make sure you like and subscribe and share wherever possible. And I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Peace.